Thank you very much, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. It's the first time I've been in Glenties. I usually watch the live stream, and it's lovely to be here in person. I hadn't put down too many thoughts, in part because things have been moving so quickly politically, but also because I was on holiday until yesterday and wasn't very keen for the awfulness of current politics to infect my little bubble in Bordeaux. But like Dahi, I find it hard to be very optimistic, and I'm sorry if you were hoping for some sort of hopeful projection of the future, because as a member of an institution that hasn't sat for 18 months and Brexit in the tracks, there is very little to be hopeful about. In terms of the topic that we're discussing, as well as North-South and East-West relationships, I do want to look at relationships within Northern Ireland as well, because however traduced it has been, I think the framework John Hume put together, and that's in the Good Friday Agreement, the three-stranded approach, is still the biggest and the best way to look at relationships on these islands. And I think there's an enjoyable irony in the fact that even those who rejected the agreement for so many years now cloak themselves, however improperly, in the language for their protection. And there's a less enjoyable irony in the fact that the whole of Europe is talking about the Good Friday Agreement, and it's so fundamental in the Brexit negotiations, but of course, when you go to Belfast, its institutions aren't alive, and the North-South Ministerial Council and the Executive and some of those things that should protect us aren't in place, and I think that is fairly typical of the political culture in the North at the moment. The biggest challenge to face us in many, many generations, and our politicians walked off the pitch, because in our politics, problems aren't there to be solved, they're just ammunition for your old battles. We've heard from Mark Durkan and others who were very involved in those negotiations 20 years ago why there weren't so many explicit references to the European Union in the Good Friday Agreement. It's because of the Euroscepticism that would have been in political unionism and in Sinn Féin at the time. But in my head, I've always considered it a sort of a fourth strand, and European Union being a backdrop and a framework that allowed ambiguity about some of those thorny issues, that allowed us to dial down issues around the Constitution, around sovereignty, around allegiance. And it's the tragedy of Brexit that all of that has been slammed back into our everyday discourse, which was literally the last thing that we needed in Northern Ireland. It remains to be seen the extent to which Europe will be part of the relationship on an East-West basis, but we hope that some of the political imagination that came up with the Good Friday Agreement that allows Northern Ireland to be both British and Irish might be found again, some constitutional creativity that will potentially allow us to be both in and out of the European Union. Taking each of the relationships that we're discussing in turn, Dahi referred to the previous high points of British-Irish relationships, and of course I think we probably all think of the Queen's visit and President Higgins's address in London, but it is very true that cooperating as friends and equals in the European Union was fundamental to solving the issues in Northern Ireland, and we know that for both communities to be bought in Northern Ireland, both governments need to be up for it and cooperating, and we're seeing in very real time the damaging impact when that isn't the case. And I try and look as objectively as I can at this, what the Trumpification of the governing party in the UK and the complete disregard for the interests and the motivations of Ireland, and regrettably the opposition in the Labour Party largely asleep at the wheel, and there are a number of notable exceptions in both of those parties. I don't think it's too dramatic to say that it doesn't look very united at the moment. We may not be dealing directly with the United Kingdom in 10 or 20 years, but whether it's England and Wales or the entity that we're currently dealing with, I don't think we're going to be able to get away from the virus of English nationalism that drove Brexit, and that probably will characterise those relationships. And I say that as somebody from a very moderate tradition of nationalism that was quite prepared to prioritise reconciliation in the North, prioritise the economy over nationalism, and indeed was quite open to some of the positive social democratic aspects of the UK and comfortable being in an outward-looking UK, celebrating things like the NHS. But Brexit and the political context since that referendum has really ripped that comfort blanket away from many of us. In terms of North-South relationships, the plates really are shifting, and I think it's important that Democratic Ireland owns that decision and that change and begins to plan for it. Post the referendum, I think there's a closeness and a looking to Dublin that nationalists, in particular in the North, hadn't done in very many years, and I think even those moderate nationalists are saying that if we're at some sort of constitutional ground zero after Brexit, then absolutely we should be recalibrating those relationships on a north-south basis. And I think the instinct of avoiding political turbulence that many people would have had in terms of not agitating for things like Irish unity, when we are dealing with political turbulence on a daily basis, anyway, that argument goes out of the window. Within Northern Ireland, of course, I don't think it's breaking news that things aren't very positive, and I think aided and abetted by Brexit, and I think by very deliberate moves by the two main parties, things are very polarised and overwhelmingly dominated by identity. And as we know in the North, if an identity issue is on the table, those who share that identity will run towards that, and those who don't will run in the opposite direction. And absolutely every issue gets pulled to the extremes in that way. And I think DUP in particular, I will say, are using Brexit primarily as a cipher for what they wanted to do anyway. One had a very puddle-deep commitment to Europe, and literally within a couple of hours of the referendum result, we're making it about a border poll. And the DUP, who say time and again that they don't want a hard border, but take every single opportunity they have got in Westminster to harden Brexit, and have taken no opportunities to vote for a softer type of Brexit. So I don't get any real sense, I'm sorry to say, from either party that they view Brexit in anything other than how it fits with their own political strategy. And I think both, I mean, if we look at the customs votes last week in Westminster, both could have been the margin for victory in that vote if either had chosen to put the interests of Northern Ireland and the interests of the whole island ahead of their own narrow ideology. And I regret that. And I must say, while I think Dublin have played a blinder in the Brexit negotiations, I would have one point of difference. The Thomas just said at the weekend that it's almost irrelevant what happens in London because the negotiations are happening in the EU. And while I have a lot of faith in Dublin and Brussels to mitigate the impact of Brexit, really it's only London that can decide that they want a softer Brexit or to end Brexit, and that is still, not extinguished as a possibility. And I must say our party's preference is absolutely a solution that includes all of the UK being in the single market and the customs union. And we say that as a party that are wholly committed to the European ideals and want the single market to be strong and want an extra 50 million people in that, and want people in Britain to have those benefits as well. I harbour some hope that this very bleak part and the increasing talk of a no deal is some sort of darkest hour before the dawn. But I think it is very clear that if we do have a hard Brexit and if we do have any form of infrastructure on the border, there will have to be a border poll. For now, though, the border poll is being sold as Brexit was, as the simple answer to absolutely everything. And it's my view that you don't follow one big vacuous conversation on a big constitutional issue with another one without doing some serious planning. But of course, as you can imagine, any caution on the tone or the timing of that is always pinned as a sop to unionism and weakness and so on. But you can see some parallels between those two campaigns, and we know Brexit in very many cases wasn't about Brexit. If you don't like the smoking ban, vote for Brexit. If you don't like feminists or Polish people, vote for Brexit. Whatever your grind is, vote for Brexit. And I fear something similar happening with our border poll. Don't like orange marches? Brexit. don't like the Brexit, and it is a very narrowing of politics that will suck all of the nuance out of debate. And as we know from everywhere else in Europe, populism can take hold in that context, and we know that there's no constitutional arrangement on these islands or anywhere else that will make all of your problems or your neighbours that you don't get on with go away. And we know that modern states aren't built on sort of sliding a victory past a very substantial minority. Just in terms of the withdrawal from Europe, if it absolutely has to happen, and indeed any reunification in Ireland. If you look at Greenland, with a population of 60,000 and a sole commodity of fish, it still took them 3 years to extricate themselves from the European Union. So whatever constitutional change happens, we will have a relationship with one another for very many years to come. Even the technicalities of the discussion on a referendum on this issue are going to be very challenging. What competence does the UK have for running a referendum? If we look at a lot of the irregularities that have come to light in terms of vote leave and the money sloshing around and the preparedness of people to take that, it would worry you about the tenor of that debate. And particularly we are in a post-truth sort of politics, and post-fact politicians can go to places that many others can't. As Barack Obama said last week, it used to be when you caught them on lying, they've held their hands up, and now people do keep on lying. And I think that's very, very worrying because, of course, you know, a myth is halfway around the world before the reality has its boots on still. But I think to manage that political turbulence, politicians who want to combat populism need to work together a lot more and need to widen political participation. It's still a fact that far less than 1% of the population, and I suspect a higher preponderance in a room like this, but is involved with the boring business of democracy and running elections. And in that context, that's how populism breeds, and that sort of distance from political institutions. So in short, I think those relationships within Northern Ireland, North-South, and between these islands are going to lead a lot less rage and a lot more reason. But what is very clear, that whatever chaos or immiseration strategies that we have, we already have the solutions. In some ways, nobody in the 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement has come up with a better idea and a better set of strands or a better infrastructure to manage those relationships, and no one has come up with a better solution than partnership, than power sharing, than compromise, and non-violence. If we were going to design some sort of set of structures to get us out of this hole, it would look very much like the Good Friday Agreement. So I hope all of those who value those principles can give some shape and meaning to some of those solutions. That was an honourable compromise between two traditions, two sets of people with very different constitutional aspirations. And if we double down on that, we can hopefully continue to fulfil those promises of partnership and peace.